My name is Joe Aiello. I am the Rail Passengers Field Coordinator. Welcome to another edition of our webinar series. We'll be covering state-supported services today. I go through a quick rundown of what you'll be seeing today. Doing the introduction, our own Jeans-Gail, VP of Government Affairs and Policy, will be giving a legislative update on the new Congress. Then we will get to our state-supported services panel, featuring Wayne Davis, the chairman from the TrainRiders Northeast, Laura Kliewer, the director for the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, and then Deborah Fischer Stout, the president of the Northern Flyer Alliance. We will then have a Q&A moderated by Madi, Butler, our communications manager, and Sean, Wayne, Laura, and Deborah will be joined by Jim Mathews, Rail Passengers President and CEO. So with that, I welcome Jeans-Gail to kick us off.
Thank you, Joe. As Joe already told us, we have a great panel today. So I'm going to try to be very quick with this legislative update. There are a lot of things happening, and I think it's important to lay, kind of a groundwork for what's going on in DC to provide context for the update we're about to receive from our three panelists. So, Joe, can I get the next slide? It's been a very eventful first couple of weeks for, again, maybe like 2 weeks for the Biden administration. And of course, the transition team has been working hard since November. So we've already received a proposal outline from them for the March for kind of a COVID-19 relief bill. I think would be maybe the final COVID-19 relief bill. They're also talking about a February drop for their infrastructure proposal, which should be exciting. It's a pretty aggressive timeline. February for a newly inaugurated president. However, they are starting to put the pieces in place at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Pete Buttigieg received a bipartisan endorsement just this morning for the Secretary of Transportation role by the Senate Commerce Committee. It was, I think, 21-3, which is about as unanimous as you're going to get in Washington, D.C. in the year 2021. Polly Trottenberg, also named as Deputy Secretary of USDOT. She was formerly the commissioner of the New York City Transportation Agency, the chief, and had a really strong kind of role as an advocate for transit, for bike and pedestrian infrastructure, just generally moving away from a car-dominated view of how transportation should work in a city. So we're excited to see what kind of role she plays in the administration. We've also seen Emmett Bose named as Deputy Administrator at the FRA. He's got a strong background in rail. He's previously served at the FRA and has also spent time at NJT. So, I think the Biden administration wants to get some of those undersecretaries, the second in commands in place, because you don't have to wait for the Senate to move on those. But that being said, Buttigieg, who has a very high profile nationally compared to a lot of the other transportation secretaries we've dealt with, he's moving very quickly, and he seems to have gotten some really positive bipartisan endorsements during the nomination process. Can I get the next slide? The timing is coming into focus for the first, I'd say, three to 4 months of 2021. First up will be that COVID-19 package I referenced earlier. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer is targeting mid-March passage, which would be good. A lot of the funding that was provided in the December bill expires at the end of March. So you don't want there to be a gap there. It's going to be focused, I think, a lot on providing funding to ramp up the vaccine distribution infrastructure. There will be, of course, some unemployment insurance provisions, but there will also be payments to state and local governments. I think that's been a priority, and transportation as well. Schumer declared mass transit stands to win big in the next COVID package. He also targeted the Hudson River tunnels, although it was unclear whether he meant COVID-19 or the infrastructure bill. But regardless, we are moving ahead and targeting that as the vehicle for restoration of daily service, bringing back the furloughed employees, and generally returning service at across the national network and the Northeast corridor to pre-pandemic levels. Good news on that front is Senate Budget Chair Bernie Sanders has signaled his intent to use budget reconciliation. I'm not going to go deep into that as a kind of parliamentary tactic, but he will be using it for the pandemic and infrastructure bills. The important thing is that it establishes a 50 vote threshold, and it's limited spending, but spending tends to be the hardest part of an infrastructure bill, so it's still very useful. That means you're going to have some very, I think, moderate senators become very important, and both sides of the aisle. Susan Collins from Maine, maybe Wayne will give us a little bit of insight into her thinking during the panel section. We'll also have Senator Daines on the Democratic side from Montana and Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia. Now, Daines, Manchin, Collins, all been very strong on rail. Senator Manchin is looking for a daily cardinal, and so we're looking to leverage what they're after into gains for passengers. Joe, can I get the next slide? But that's a lot, I think, a longer term that has to do a lot with the reauthorization cycle, which I think will be, when people talk about an infrastructure bill, I think realistically, they're talking about reauthorization, which is a 6-year funding bill that we'll have to tackle before September 2021. First things first, it's to get the trains back on track. And that means using COVID-19 legislation. So our legislative staff is calling senators and House appropriators and asking them to provide $1.541 billion in funding in the next round of emergency pandemic funding. That will include enough money to restore long distance rail to daily, support state supported routes and commuter rail services, as well as bring back employees furloughed due to COVID. We also are calling for very clear guidelines, stipulations to be included with the funding. It's not a blank check for Amtrak. It should come, this additional money needs to come with very specific instructions to restore daily service as soon as possible. We don't want to wait till the end of summer. I think people are getting vaccines in arms now, and it's time to move, and it's time to get people moving again. So we're targeting House and Senate appropriators. We are going to ask you, our members, and members of the writing public even, to do the same. A campaign will be coming shortly, but really just, you can call them today even and just ask them, please include Amtrak in the next round of COVID funding. Ensure that they get $1.5 billion, and ensure there's language requiring them to bring back trains, bring back furloughed employees. Next slide, Joe. So if there's any questions, put them in the chat. We're going to come back to them during the Q&A at the end of the panels. Again, pleased to be joined by our panel. A lot of great transportation thinkers here. We're going to open today with Wayne Davis, chairman of TrainRiders Northeast. Wayne has been leading the movement for better rail service in the Northeast, New England and the Northeast for more than 30 years, founding member of TrainRiders Northeast, and played a crucial role in bringing the Downeaster to Portland, Maine in 2001 and Brunswick, Maine in 2012. He's also a former council member of our association. They gave us many years of distinguished service. TrainRiders Northeast is currently working on an across the platform Amtrak connection at Boston's North Station that would serve Worcester, Springfield, Point South, all the way through New York's Penn Station. So excited to hear more from him. I'm going to turn it over to you now, Wayne.
Thank you. I'm Wayne Davis, and I'm chairman of TrainRiders, which was formed in 1989 as a 501c3 educational nonprofit all-volunteer organization. I won't go back in history of our early years, since everyone has access to a film that gives you the colorful side of our 32-year odyssey to restore rail service between Boston, New Hampshire, and Maine. It took 12 years before the first train operated between those 2 points, and an additional 3 years to extend that service to Freeport and Brunswick. From that time to this, we've spent time not only to plan extensions, but who knew that we'd have to work as hard as we do to keep the service operating despite its remarkable success. Trains magazine called our Downeaster service America's favorite train in the early years due to the Downeaster's remarkable customer service ratings about our onboard volunteer train hosts and station hosts, the sharply dressed, excuse me, and cordial conductors, and the quality of the train's excellent catered food service. But I wander. Get me going on our train and I could go for days. So let's go back to advocacy and state operated service. After we had collected 90,000 Maine signatures and convinced our governor, the Commissioner of Transportation, and our legislature to adopt our rail passenger service bill, we were on our way, clutching the first citizen-initiated bill ever adopted by the Maine legislature. I and a few others of our new board members took our DOT commissioner to Washington along with a hired transportation consultant to meet with Graham Claytor, Amtrak's president, and as it turned out, all 8 senior vice president department heads to discuss the opportunity. For 2 hours during the meeting, I found myself wandering and wondering who was running the railroad. Everybody was in with us. Following that meeting, I met with Mr. Claytor, who was very frank in telling me that if we wanted train service, we were already on our way to success by having made it the law in Maine for our legislature to seek and use funding from all sources to have Amtrak extend their service to Portland. He also said that we'd have to have the best train equipment available for this proposed new service, something he said he could take care of. But we also has to be forthful in our request for at least 6 trains a day. He also said we should insist on 79 miles an hour, nothing less, and shoot for 110 with improvements over time, since there were enough Amtrak trains running about the country at 40 miles an hour. And he also said, once you begin the service, advertise, advertise, advertise. Local advertising is best. True, Amtrak advertises nationally, but he quipped that the only people who really knew that Amtrak operated in many places were rail fans. So all advertising should be done locally. We took all of his suggestions as cornerstones for our proposed service, and they still guide the Downeaster service today. Some may remember that we asked for 6 trains. They laughed and laughed and offered 3. We argued, and they offered us 4. We argued for 5, and much later decided that half a loaf was better than none and accepted the 4. But after 3 years of service and sold out trains, surprise, surprise, a 5th trip was added. Amazing growth, and the Downeaster was carrying 2,000 passengers a day when COVID-19 hit. In fiscal year 2019, the annual operating budget we had was $24 million per year. $21 million was directed to train operations, including fuel and host railroad expense. It cost about $2 million to support stations, food service operations, and marketing. The remaining expenses were to support administration, insurances, etc. Approximately $12 million was generated in passenger revenue. The difference was paid for using a combination of state funds, federal funds, and municipal station contributions. COVID has complicated the mix. Passenger revenue is only about 15% of pre-COVID levels, and expenses are about 80% of what they were pre-COVID. The Downeaster has been able to sustain service due to the CARES Act funding available to Amtrak, which has been used to offset the cost of Amtrak operating expenses. And other federal transit funding aimed to maintain workforces and therefore used to support operations. But again, I wander and include. I'd like to see a short clip of a recent clip from Brunswick to Exeter, New Hampshire and back, where train riders interviewed passengers and crew during these difficult times. Our train has proved to be essential transportation for folks who must travel to jobs and medical facilities in our region. And for the first time recently, a few folks are traveling to visit family and friends. Not many tourists yet. And again, I find myself wondering, and again, could go on for days. How do I end here? Other federal support operations. And again, as I say, I guess we end with not many tourists yet, but there's still, we are looking forward to the summer. And that's it. It's time for the video. We're here, we decided with the pandemic and the rest of the issues that seem to have affected everybody, we are interviewing passengers on board the train, both northbound and southbound. We're finding very interesting things about the passengers. There are a lot of repeats from before the epidemic, and there are some new first riders, which is wonderful to see, because they felt safer on the train than they did with some of the alternatives that were available to them. And flying was one of the ones that we've noticed several times. People preferred the train to what would normally be a flight for them going somewhere else. So it's good to see that America's favorite train is back in service again. Every day the ridership increases, which is wonderful to say. We are quite a ways away from 2,000 passengers a day, but we are on our way.
Either of you concerned about going on the train during the pandemic?
We're not that concerned or we wouldn't be here. So we know we got to wear a mask. I think we're as safe as we can be.
It's not clean once a day, it's clean after every round trip. So what they'll do, coach cleaners will come on with big spray canners, so they'll spray all the seats, wipe down all the tables, all the chairs, business class, and even all through the whole train. So when the train just gets sprayed, it means it's getting wiped out. So they'll get wipes down, they'll wipe the doors down, and by each coach car you have a little small part of the jelly, there's hand sanitizer there. So you can walk through any coach like that. If you just, other than just soap in the bathroom, you can hand sanitize your hands just walking through if you like. So everything gets sprayed, even the carpets get sprayed here. After one round trip, it doesn't go for one day. So one train makes one round trip, gets sanitized, cleaned out, the ultra clean, then it goes out again.
One of the important items, aside from incredible cleaning process with the trains each day, is the air exchange. Both the exhaust fans in the roof are drawing out the stale air every 3 to 4 minutes. The entire air in the coach has been exhausted and the fresh air is flowing in through the side. That's a feature, that is most attractive to people from a safety standpoint.
Everybody is required to wear face coverings or face masks. If they come to our train and they don't have a face mask available, we can provide one to them. And obviously, if they come into the cafe, I believe you can see the sign right there. There's social distancing signs that you need to keep 6 feet apart from each other if you come into the cafe car. If you don't want to come into the cafe car, our protocol with the cafe attendants, they can bring the food to you at your seats. And then, of course, while seating in the train, we don't have seats that are designated no-sit seats for the passengers. But the passengers are just reminded to social distance board the train once they're seating. Some passengers sit near other passengers, and we're not required to tell them to distance themselves from each other. It's basically, I guess, just amongst the passengers, they just have to figure that out on their own, and they're usually pretty good about that. But we can have ask people to get off the train if they do refuse to wear a mask, because it is required on all trains.
I'm going down to Boston for medical care. It's every couple months I have to go down. Just thankful that I have this option and don't have to drive.
Well, I have to make the long trip all the way down to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania today. So I'm going to Boston. I'm taking the regional afterwards. And for such a long trip, obviously, only two options are either train or air. And, you know, with everything that's going on right now, didn't really feel like going on with the hustle and bustle of the airport and getting to and from. And I had some things that I needed to work on today, job applications and stuff like that, and I thought I might as well enjoy it while I'm doing it, while I travel. So I sort of chose this as a way to decompress and, you know, find another way to enjoy my travel since I have to go such a long way anyway.
Sometimes I'll drive in and sometimes I'll just take the train because it's a lot easier than driving from like Maine to Boston, especially during traffic hours if you have to go to work. Like it takes me 4 hours driving, so I appreciate the train a lot.
I'm coming back to Boston. I was just in Portland to visit some friends. Yeah, I thought this Downeaster train was really convenient, especially coming from Boston. So I do think I'll ride it again in the future.
All right. Thank you, Wayne. That was a really good marketing piece, I think, for the role trains probably should have been playing a little bit more during the pandemic, which is providing a safe way to travel for people who worked in essential jobs and needed to get there, and also frankly, it would have been a way to expand the user base. Unfortunately, on a lot of the network, we ended up going at the cut service route, and so we probably there's some missed opportunities there for new converts to passenger trains. But that's was a really informative video. I believe we will go. So yeah, check out TrainRiders Northeast on their website and Facebook. Doing a lot of good work. We're gonna go on to the next presenter. Laura Kliewer, who's the director of the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission. We have had the pleasure of working with Laura during the FRA's Midwest kind of network planning sessions over the course of the last few years, and really enjoyed it. MIPRIC is an 8-state compact commission of state legislators, governors, designees working to preserve and expand passenger rail throughout the Midwest. And Laura served as MIPRIC's director since inception in 2000, working with commissioners, partners, and allies to ensure that the federal government develops an enduring collaboration with the states for passenger rail development, similar to other modes of transportation. She's been doing a great job, and I look forward to what she has to say about the future of the Midwest Network. Laura, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. And thank you to the RPA for hosting this webinar and for all of you who are participating. Today, I'm going to talk mainly about more overall state supported service opportunities and concerns, but we'll tell you just a tiny bit about what is going on with MIPIRC, and I'll be emphasizing the Midwest too, but especially the concerns are things that would affect all state supported service. So next slide, please. As Sean said, MIPIRC is currently a 8-state compact. We have 3 other states that can join. And we work through our member states and partners to promote, coordinate, and support passenger rail service improvements. Next slide, please. And here's just a list of our current states. And actually four other states are eligible to join. Iowa, Nebraska, Ohio, and South Dakota can also join the compact. And actually currently both Iowa and Nebraska have legislation up in their legislatures to rejoin the compact. Both of those states used to be part of the compact. So we're hoping that in both of those states that happens. And John Davis in my office is on the webinar too, so he can send the bill numbers in chat for those two pieces of legislation. And if you're in Iowa or Nebraska specifically, it would be great if you could advocate for that. Next slide, please. So as I'm sure most, if not all of you know, since the passage of the Passenger Rail Investment and Improvement Act of 2008, any passenger rail service of less than 750 miles from start to end point must be paid for by the states. And the Midwest now has 8 state-supported passenger rail routes. All of these existed prior to PREA, and all of them except for Michigan's were already being paid for by states. Michigan was included part of the national network, and then because of the distance of its lines, it started having to pay brand new for service. But during the 10 years between FY 2009 and FY 2019, ridership on Midwestern corridor routes increased 9% and revenue grew by 33%. Next slide, please. So Illinois, Michigan, and Missouri all received HISPR or high-speed interstate passenger rail funding in the stimulus in the late 2000s. And they've also received subsequent grants to make improvements on their state-supported lines. For Missouri, that resulted in much better on-time performance as their projects address specific chokehold areas in their St. Louis to Kansas City line. And on both Illinois' Chicago to St. Louis and Michigan's Chicago to Detroit lines, improvements are already have already made trip times faster and more reliable, and will result in 110 mile per hour service. Michigan has had 110 mile per hour service on parts of its line since 2012. And then in addition, Michigan, Illinois, Missouri, and Wisconsin received a grant from the FRA to buy new equipment for the current state-supported routes. And these 4 states formed an agreement under our authority, the Midwest Interstate Passenger Rail Commission, to own and manage the equipment. It's manufactured by Siemens, and the agreement specifies that other states can join in the future as they establish new service. And as far as on our corridors, locomotives began arriving in 2017. They're now on all the routes, and passenger rail cars began arriving for testing in the Midwest during the last quarter of 2020. And it's right now, they're on test routes in Michigan. Next slide, please. And here's just a slide of some of the car enhancements that passengers will experience on the new train cars. Next slide, please. So as far as overall opportunities for state-supported service, MIPIRC states applied for and received more than $300 million in federal passenger rail grants that were made available through the 3 FAST Act passenger rail specific grants. The Christie grants there were 4 rounds that were not specifically PTC related, and MIPIRC states received $190.4 million for that, and every MIPIRC state received at least 1 grant through Christie during that 5 years. The state federal partnership. We had 3 rounds, and there were Midwest states, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin received a total of 101.4 million for 6 projects. And then the last one, which has been the really the very low funded one, I know only 100 million was provided in the FAST Act and less than that appropriated. But our Minnesota and Wisconsin did receive one of the 3 or 4, I think it was 4 total grants that were awarded for their second frequency between the Twin Cities and Chicago. So that's just kind of giving you an idea of how our Midwestern states have taken advantage of that and how other regions and other states can do the same. You know, of course, FAST Act needs to be reauthorized, and we hope to see even stronger, you know, grants and opportunities for passenger rail development in the next reauthorization. Next slide, please. And I have also just as a slide, I think Joe's going to put up our reauthorization principles, MIPR's reauthorization principles, so you all can see the overall principles that we have been advocating for during the reauthorization process. So in the Midwest, other opportunities and currently several states are in the process of establishing new routes and or additional frequencies. In addition to the second frequency I mentioned previously, Illinois is working on Chicago to Moline, which originally was Chicago, it is Quad Cities to Des Moines, and then eventually to Omaha, Nebraska. The Illinois is doing its part of establishing service to Moline, the Quad Cities on the border of Iowa. And then they're also have Wisconsin looking at adding additional frequencies on its very popular and high ridership Chicago to Milwaukee Hiawatha service. And then we have several in the planning stages. There's a lot of them. The 3 that are probably the most far along are in Minnesota, the Twin Cities to Duluth route that has had some funding, and it's moving along in establishing new passenger rail service to Duluth from the Twin Cities. In Kansas, there's the extension of the Heartland Flyer, so that it would be coming up from Fort Worth and Oklahoma City to connect via Wichita, Kansas. So Wichita would have its first passenger rail service since the inception of Amtrak, I believe, via Wichita and Newton to connect with the Southwest Chief. So those are, and then in Ohio, Ohio has been largely the metropolitan planning organizations have been working on putting forward, and the Indiana Passenger Rail Association moving forward with Chicago to Columbus, Ohio via Fort Wayne, Indiana. So MIPRG strongly supports all of these and has worked to facilitate them moving forward. And then we've also, in the Midwestern states, taken advantage of the previously Tiger, now Build grants, and received more than $333 million over the 12 rounds of that funding for a variety of improvements on both short and long distance. And there's a list of it there that I won't go into. Next slide, please. So as far as other opportunities for the future, the Midwest, part of some of the things that I mentioned previously, but other projects totaling more than $2 billion are in the scoping and final design construction stages as of about a year ago. Minnesota did receive that funding that for its last capital and its starting up operations, and does have to have the state match to have that become a reality. And then Sean had mentioned that the Midwest has had a FRA-led planning visioning process to develop a 40-year vision for the region's passenger rail service and governance. And it's in its very final stages as far as what the FRA will release. And it's a very high level visioning process. So we have a lot that we already have in the pipeline and a lot to work on in the future. Next slide. So challenges overall for state supported service include sustained federal funding for capital projects. States, very few states have been willing to make very substantive planning on passenger rail development because of not being assured that the capital funding will be there. And so we have always advocated ever since MIPRC's inception for a dedicated source of funding for passenger rail development. We hope to see that happen. Amtrak's CEO Flynn has asked Congress in his letter that Sean had mentioned to also establish some kind of trust fund. That one was Amtrak specific, but we would like to see it also be for states. And of course, if Amtrak takes more leadership, as they've said they want to in actual development of corridors, then we'd be more than happy to work together with them. And federal assistance with startup operations for new and ongoing service has been weak. It was non-existent. And with the FAST Act, as I mentioned, the R&E money that was given was only 100 million. And it just is not enough to really help states with the R&E provides 3 years of operating assistance so that the service can get started up, which is awesome. But we need more. We're going to need more and more and more of that, because if states are going to invest in this, they really do need help. It's been very expensive for the states to run state or support state supported service. And we also have concerns about the Amtrak performance tracking system that allocates costs and revenues to service lines, and have asked Congress to review that to determine whether costs associated with the national network are inflated. And those are some of the current concerns that we have. And then potential ones are, for our region, the FRA-led Midwest Regional Rail Plan, as I mentioned, is a high-level vision. Once it's finalized, the states will have the responsibility for carrying out the vision. We hope that our region can perhaps get some funding to continue to carry that on, so that our states can work together to actually do the more, drill down into prioritizing the lines, figuring out, how the states are going to work together to carry out the 40-year vision. And of course, lastly, I'd like to talk just a minute about that the national network depends on the connectivity and service provided by both long distance and state supported service. Next slide, please. So these are MIPRC's 8 long distance routes. Altogether, these routes have 80 station stops across the Midwest, and many traverse a diverse landscape of rural communities not served by other forms of intercity transportation. Next slide, please. And so, as Sean mentioned, the problems that Amtrak thought would be record ridership for 2020 has instead, since March of 2020, seen ridership decreases up to 95%. I won't go into all that you all know the cuts that Amtrak made. Next slide. But the impact of the cuts are what concern us. I mean, it's definitely affected connectivity to even the state-supported routes. And of course, the state-supported routes have had to cut back their service as well. But it's really hard to plan to take it when there's only three days a week service. The Midwestern states are already losing money because of the reduction in long distance passenger rail service, and could lose up to $573 million in direct and indirect economic losses, thanks to the RPA and their great work in getting this information together. But this is what the Midwest would stand to lose, and it's just really tough. So that's about all. My contact information to MIPIRC is on the last slide, and I'd be glad to talk to you all about more in depth about opportunities and concerns for state-supported service. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. That was really informative and a lot of information in there. We will be having a recording, and we will offer the PDF version of the presentation on our website, so people can go back and review, because I know there's a lot of information, very dense. And also, we uploaded the file of your Surface Transportation Reauthorization principles. So I encourage everyone to review that. And frankly, the last couple slides there, where we talk about how we balance the needs of states to have kind of control over what happens versus the strength of the federal government to come in and provide, a steady funding, are going to be really interesting ideas to pursue, and I hope we get to that in the panel. Okay, and bringing us home will be Deborah Fischer Stout. Pleased to be joined by Deborah. She's been the president of the Northern Flyer Alliance since 2008, working to build better economic relationships between Kansas and Oklahoma through the establishment of a rail corridor, passenger rail corridor, that will connect the Southwest Chief and the Heartland Flyer, which is I think it's a gap that troubles a lot of our members. Former Kansas and Missouri representative for our association, and we're always glad to have her back. And Deborah helped secure the passage of the Passenger Rail Program Act, which was signed into law by Governor Parkinson in 2010, excuse me. And most recently revived the Passenger Rail Caucus in the Kansas State Legislature. So I think she has a lot to offer us today about, how you reach your local officials and from both parties, frankly, and encourage them to join into the campaign to build a better state rail network. Deborah, take it away, please.
All right. Thank you for that introduction. The Northern Flyer Alliance is a state-level rail advocacy organization. We started in 2006. I got involved in 2007, and in 2008 we became incorporated. But before I talk about how we advocate, I'd like to start with some historical outcomes from advocacy. In 2010, as Sean mentioned, our signature legislation got passed, the Passenger Rail Program Act. Plus there was a state rail plan that included passenger rail for the first time. In 2011, there was a service development plan. In 2015, a throughway bus. In 2017, an inspection train. And in 2020, a transportation plan that included operational support. Next slide, please. Our mission is to close this 200-mile service gap, and it's known as the Heartland Flyer Extension. As you can see, this will open up ridership across large sectors of the country. It would connect nearly 14 million people from Kansas City to Dallas-Fort Worth, and it connects the Chicago hub network with the South Central US. There would be 5 to 6 additional stops on the Heartland Flyer Extension, including Wichita, Ark City, Ponca City, Perry, Guthrie, and potentially Edmond. Next. Taking advantage of opportunities is how we have functioned from day one, and there are essentially two types. Next slide. You want to use either to get to know state legislators and get your foot in the door with opportunities. So you might wonder, well, why does this work? Well, let's face it, state reps want to look good, and you want to make it easy for them to grasp the concept that you're selling. So if you have a one-pager with bullet points, it's very, very helpful and appreciated. And then also you want to give them the opportunity to showcase their leadership capabilities. And for those that that's important to, they will thank you with friendship and a certain level of trust. Next slide. These are just examples of external opportunities, and by no means is it a complete list. But starting with the Reauthorization Act, prior to COVID, talk of that act was the opportunity that we took advantage of last year, getting a resolution of support for funding from both the Kansas Senate and the Oklahoma House in 2020. ARA funding was one of the first external opportunities that we decided to act on, culminating in a resolution of support in the Kansas Senate, which led to our signature effort, the Passenger Rail Program Act of 2010 that Sean mentioned earlier. And then in 2015 was the FAST Act. A local leader that we recruited was responsible for meeting with the mayor of Wichita and executives from BNSF, Amtrak, and KDOT. They met in Topeka at the Capitol the day after the FAST Act passed. My understanding was Wichita's mayor was totally against this idea prior to the meeting and totally for it afterwards. Certainly a new president is an opportunity to talk to your state leaders. It's with new expected legislation, certainly a great reason to connect. And Kansas had a new governor in 2018. We met with her a month before she was elected. She remembered us, she remembered our legislation, she remembered voting for it. She told us that she was in favor of the project, and we feel that that has a lot to do with one of the reasons why operational funding is included in our new transportation plan. Now, for the sake of expediency, we're just going to go through some of these other opportunities. If you have any questions about them, please mention them in the chat and I'll try and get to them. But once again, it's not an all-inclusive list. Next slide. We spent 2 years getting resolutions of support, pretty much from 2007 to 2009. We would speak to anybody that would listen to us. Lots of presentations out of the town, out of state. It was all along a 600-mile corridor from Kansas City to Dallas-Fort Worth, a total of 90 resolutions of support, and there was 4 or 5 of us that participated in this effort. We then took those resolutions of support to the Senate Transportation Committee in 2009, and the outcome of that was, number one, we had a state rail plan that included passenger rail for the first time. And then KDOT also applied for an additional $10 million in ARA funding. This next piece is about local leaders. You want to find local leaders that are willing to take on a leadership role. You'll be amazed at some of the things they can do. I met with a Wichita City Councilman. I brought my boss with me. We drove down from Kansas City to Wichita to meet with this city councilman. We talked about the business case for passenger rail, and at the beginning of the meeting, he was quite interested, but had a lot of questions. At the end of that 1-hour presentation, he slammed his hand on the table and said, "I'm in, and I'm willing to take a leadership role." So we felt quite lucky. He's largely responsible for the throughway bus between Newton and Oklahoma City and the inspection train in 2017. Next. And then last, be willing to do something hard. Writing resolutions really isn't hard, but writing the legislation was kind of hard. And you need to find a sponsor also, and we found one through going to chamber events, and that's another thing. I highly encourage you to reach out to business leaders and legislators that go to these chamber events. But we always had resolutions ready to go whenever we gave presentations. We wanted to make it as easy as possible for whomever we were working with. And then we just completed a year-long marketing campaign that resulted in now 28 Kansas Rail Caucus members. And I don't think you can see the end of that, but at the very end, there's the symposium that we gave in 2012. And I want to talk about that because we wanted to keep the momentum going. In 2010, we got the bill passed. In 2011, there was a service development plan. And in 2012, we put together this symposium. We held it at Kansas City's Union Station. We had 100 people in attendance and 16 speakers from all across the country. We had great media coverage, and it was a very positive event moving forward. Next slide. Now I'd like to reach out to all the Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas folks on this call. We would very much appreciate you reaching out to us via these platforms, and we could really use your help with volunteering. Thank you so much. That concludes my presentation.
Thank you, Deborah. And we'll make sure we get this out to all our members in those states, because I know there's a huge appetite there for restoring that link. Okay, Maddie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I know we got a couple of good questions lined up from both the chat and some submitted in advance. And we will be joined, by the way, by our president and CEO, Jim Mathews. So Jim, turn that camera on. Thank you, Maddie.
Okay, we should all be able to talk now. Let me get Jim too. Okay, we should all be unmuted or able to unmute ourselves. And then Wayne is joining us as well. Fantastic. Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us today. I've been fielding questions from just our members, members of the press, people who are following along with the series. For the sake of time, we're going to condense some of those questions. We'll be providing written follow-up for all those questions that y'all submitted that we're not addressing on air at this time. So Joe, if I can get the next slide. So if you want to follow along, see the slides that we've been shown today and see what our guests have shared, revisit this presentation, railpassengers.org/webinars is where you're going to be able to find all of the information that we're sharing today. So just be sure to register for our upcoming webinars, stay engaged, stay a part of this. And again, if your Q&A question is not addressed in this time, please email me directly. We'll make sure that we provide you written follow-up. So let's jump into it. Our first question: what is the best way to approach a congressional representative, such as Adam Kinzinger, who has no less than 6 Amtrak and state-supported routes crossing his district, with 2 more on the planning board, to be supportive of Amtrak and other rail projects? Based on his voting record, it appears to be a non-issue for him. And I'll open the floor, whoever cares to answer this one first.
I'll start, but I would love to turn this over to our panelists who have great success in carrying out these kinds of things. But, you know, every one of us here who's been a member of our association has heard me say, when you are the constituent, it is incredibly important for you to reach out to them. When they hear from you, I live here, I vote here, and I care about that. That alone will really help. And so, I think, you know, I think Deborah Fischer Stout was spot on when she was talking about finding those folks who want to be leaders in their communities. And I was very excited to have Deborah on the panel. I will rope you back into our association. But if maybe Deborah, maybe you could start with that, and then we can roll through the rest of the panelists.
Oh yeah, sure. Well, this kind of reminds me of the question about Minnesota. Sometimes when you have reticent legislators, you need to speak to them through their constituents. And so what we did, we had a very similar situation, only it was pretty much statewide. there was a lot of, and still is a lot of anti-rail influencers in this state. So what we did was we invested in a banner and a table and a couple of chairs and a small retail tent. And we went to as many events as we could, especially outdoor events. People seemed really interested with the name, I think, Northern Flyer Alliance, but we had literature ready to go. And then when we got the KU return on investment study done, we had that ready to go. We also had printed postcards that stated exactly what we wanted legislators to do and what we wanted the governor to do. People readily signed those postcards. We had hundreds and hundreds, and we had a steady drip of those postcards going out to local legislators. By the time our bill passed in 2010, those postcards were famous. Everyone had received a postcard. If you hadn't received a postcard, you just weren't it. So that was quite great. But we did that for a couple of years, and it made a huge difference. I can tell you that the business community in Wichita was against this project because they thought that it was, I'm talking about the Heartland Flyer Extension, they thought it was competition to Wichita's airport. What it really is, it increases the catchment area of the airport. So that was one of our talking points. And if you can get your hands on a return on investment study, what we did was we reached out to a nonprofit called the Wiedemann Foundation, and they actually, we could hardly believe it, but they gave us a $10,000 grant. That grant we gave to Wally Meyer, Professor Wally Meyer at KU, and he took a semester with his master's degree students and produced a return on investment study, which I gave to RPA to post later. So that really sort of addressed this longstanding issue of, you know, you have to be profitable at the fare box. That's not where you're profitable. So anyway, that's, for both of those questions, that's really what we did.
And I'd like to add, I agree with Deborah. Pointing out the resources at the university level is we had Wichita State University was the one that created MIPIRC's video for us. If you look on our website,
it was a good video.
They were awesome. I mean, they had a really great team work together on that. And it's beautiful. And they, the studies, Missouri had a similar thing. The University of Missouri did a study for Missouri that they used as their basis for getting federal funding for addressing the choke points that I mentioned earlier. As far as congressional issues, MIPIRC is very, we have focused on the federal level because we feel that the federal partnership is what's critical for our states, and we want to see that increase. We have seen over the 20 years of the commission's existence that passenger rail tends to be a bipartisan issue among members of Congress. And so we stress that we have a very bipartisan commission, and we don't, veer away from talking to Republicans. That being said, there's always going to be those naysayers. So I don't know that it's profitable to focus on ones that have proven that they just won't support it. I mean, certainly provide them the information, but you need to develop those around you. There's lots of new there's lots of new members of Congress, those kind of things. Do that more, and certainly work with, if you're a MIPIRC state or if you belong to a state, state legislators and DOTs are what members of Congress listen to. That's when we go. That's who they want to hear from as far as what the state priorities are. So please try to align your priorities with the state. As Deborah, showed most aptly, sometimes you have to push the state to do that, but don't go too far ahead of the state to be advocating something like very off the rail plan of your state. So those are the couple things that I would say.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Thanks, y'all. Shall we move on to the next question?
Yeah.
All right.
We want to get to.
Okay, and we've kind of touched on this throughout the presentations, but let's just go one more time through it to make sure that it really sticks for everybody. In my state, Minnesota, it has become quite apparent that one major party has declared vehement, almost derisive refusal to invest in passenger rail of any sort, has become a litmus test for legislators to be granted support and power within the caucus. This has resulted in the defeat of state funding for several broadly supported intra and interstate rail projects here, even when some of those projects are shovel ready, and in one case would have gained a triple match from the federal government. This anti-rail attitude has been heavily lobbied and richly advertised by the usual suspect PACs. Has this been a roadblock to improve state rail programs elsewhere? And can anyone on the panel offer suggestions as to how this might most effectively be countered by rail advocates? I think, Deborah, you shared a lot with us on that. Wayne, Sean, do you guys have anything that you care to contribute?
I do have one other thing
Okay.
I'd like to say about this, because MIPIRG's working very closely with Minnesota on trying to get that funding that they need to have Minnesota provide the state match that Amtrak and Wisconsin have already provided. There's been a lot of misinformation, and I would say get good, strong information to them, especially on the Minnesota. Anybody here from Minnesota, get them. There's a lot of good information. The Great River Rail Commission has excellent information on the benefits to the second frequency. There's been some misinformation being that some commuter rail service received some funding to start commuter rail in the Twin Cities to the outer Twin Cities suburbs. And that wasn't fully funded, so we didn't have the ridership and everything realized. And so they've been using that as like commuter and, lumping in passenger rail overall into saying it's not worth it. And so you just have to counter that with correct information. And even it goes so far as if they say that it hasn't brought up before, explain, get information on that commuter rail project. Say why it didn't happen, why it didn't, realize what it could, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that hits the main points. I mean, this is absolutely a problem elsewhere. We saw opposition to the Bright Line project, which really slowed things down. We're seeing in Texas, and those are privately led. I mean, to give you a sense of the kind of the reactionary nature to a lot of rail proposals. Arizona specifically, it is prohibited by the state's constitution to spend state money on passenger rail, which is just, it's nonsensical. It doesn't make sense from a policy point of view. It's a thing we are concerned about, given President Biden, his nickname is Amtrak Joe. And so if you're looking to block him from getting political victories, you might focus in on Amtrak. And so we're trying to retain the strong bipartisan support we have. I think the long distance routes are very useful for that, because they serve a lot of red rural states, and they will be, I think, useful to maintain that coalition. And then, just like Laura said, you gotta just keep hammering home the correct information, dispel the disinformation, which unfortunately I just don't think is going to go away. Look at the society we live in. Too many people with too much free time on the internet, and it's just, I think it helps, by the way, having a heck of a lot of federal money. Like if you start getting 6, 7, 10 times as much available federal funds, that's essentially just low-hanging fruit for state DOT looking to put people to work and looking to better connect their citizens. It's going to be a lot harder for them to maintain that wall of opposition. So that's all I would say. Maddie, move on to the next one.
Yeah. Okay, so can I get the next slide, Joe? So we fielded questions from the chat. And so I'm going to go through these. Thank you again to everyone who submitted questions. We really love when that chat is on topic and pertinent to what we're discussing today. So this is to all panelists. If you could just give kind of like a brief understanding, what are like basic things that states could be doing to position themselves to be helpful to the incoming administration and helping to advance plans and funding for passenger rail? So this is more like what would benefit you as advocates in your participation with like state conversations? What could they do to help y'all out? Wayne?
Sean, do you want to start? Maybe.
Well, yeah, I would love to hear from our panelists here. I mean, Laura's mentioned a couple times state rail plans stay on the reservation there. Having a this is unfortunately this is not something you can kind of rush. So you either have it or you don't. But if you have a state rail plan, if you've used the intervening years since 2008 to use that initial Recovery Act money to develop something substantive at the state level, you're going to be miles ahead of your competition in terms of the other 49 states. I will say
it has to be in the rail plan.
Right.
Get the funding.
I'm hoping that we can pressure the FRA to release like the Midwestern, rail plan that
They will. I don't think it's a thing of pressure. They just want to get it, get it right.
Well, sooner the better for me. And that's a point.
Know.
Is we're in a reauthorization cycle right now, so let's not get so focused on perfection.
Well, I think we do have enough to focus on. As I mentioned, the $2 billion that the Midwest already has in the pipeline. So $2 billion is, there's a lot going on there, and there's others in the planning stages. So the States for Passenger Rail Coalition and AASHTO have done a great job in surveying the states to find out what they have for every region nationally on in what states have in the pipeline. So I would definitely, we've done it for the Midwest. We're glad to send it. In fact, John, I don't know if you have access to that you can upload a file, but we can get that to you all as far as the Midwest. What we have in the pipeline, it's from spring 2020, so it's a little bit dated. I mean, Minnesota got money since then and some others too, but find out what's in the pipeline for your states, for your region. Advocate for those.
I have a comment too. It was like 2012, 2013, we went to one of those kind of local consult meetings that Missouri had, and we were aware that the FRA was wanting to get state rail plans that coordinated with contiguous states. So when we started asking questions, it was very clear that they didn't really know what other states were doing. So as a state, if you're involved with the Department of Transportation, make sure that your state rail plans coordinate with the ones that are around you. And I think the FRA had a great idea, but I'm not sure how many people really participated in that.
Indiana right now, anybody from Indiana, they're going through their rail planning, passenger rail and freight rail rail plan process right now. And there's been a lot of good input into it from the passenger rail level, but if you haven't yet commented on it, I think you still can, and keep pressing. And that's one of the things we brought forward, Deb, just as you said, to understand that it's not just Indiana, it's the whole Midwest is relying on Indiana, not for only intrastate, but for interstate, for access to the east, for access to the south, from, southeast. So, yeah, definitely. Good point.
Can I just add really quickly? I'm hoping that our audience has really taken to heart what they've heard here in the past few minutes, because what Laura and Deborah are saying is just so vitally important. It is so much less productive to show up waving the flag for some sort of, I'll hate to say it, but kind of fantasy project that you would really like to see happen. If you haven't gone through the homework of building support for it at the local level and at the state level, so that it can at least have a shot at finding its way into the state rail plan.
Right.
It's very hard to move that needle, but that's the kind of work that has to get done, and it is almost counterproductive to go bashing on doors about things that are simply not vetted and ready to get that kind of endorsement at the state level.
And there's a lot of great projects in the Midwest. Michigan's doing a lot, Minnesota's doing a lot, Illinois is doing a lot. So look at their rail plans, there's plenty going on there.
And we'll try to link to it, but over the summer we put together a list of, try to collate a national list of projects back when we were using COVID-19 as a potential infrastructure incentive. And so we put, it's not comprehensive, but it's a resource, and we'll try to include that in the follow-up materials to this webinar. Maddie, maybe I think we're going a little long, but if you guys have unless anyone has a hard out, maybe we can take 2 more questions.
I think we're good. I actually, I have a question for Wayne. This one came in through the chat. What is the current speed limit on the Downeaster, and how do you personally feel about on-time performance through the pandemic? Do you feel as though the service is doing what's best for Maine right now?
Yes, I certainly do. When the service was suspended for several months, a lot of maintenance was done. The annual things that normally people hate to have done, but have to be done. So I don't know whether you noticed on the little clip of interviewing passengers after the pandemic hit, how smoothly the train was operating at 80 miles an hour. Most of it is at 80 miles an hour now. And as far as I know, there are no slow orders. So it's operating probably as efficiently as it did when the train was brand new. But that's because of maintenance. But one of the things, listening to the both ends of the plans here, you have some of you are looking for bringing new service to a community or to a state. And I'm amazed with Laura trying to organize 8 states. Lord, we had problems just trying to get through New Hampshire to Massachusetts. And to this day, it's still not a smooth process. So I don't know how in the world you manage the 8 states. And also listening to Deborah talk about the grassroots effort sounds more like what we did, doing the same things that you're doing now. But one of the things that I forgot, and that's what fell to the floor before my panic at the end of my talk this morning, before we showed the film, we had forgotten who's going to manage the service. We were thinking, now think ahead to when you get the service, or what you're hoping to do when you get the service. We hadn't focused on it requires management. We thought, well, Amtrak will do that. No, Amtrak operates the trains. So we needed a manager, and it was Angus King when he was governor for 8 years, and that's today's US Senator Angus King. He's the one who called one morning and said, I don't want to delay things, but I don't want my Department of Transportation managing train service. I think that we should have an independent rail authority managing it. And we hadn't focused on that point, but we stopped everything and it delayed the service about 8 or 9 months. We moaned and groaned a lot, but we did introduce the bill, and that created the Northern New England Passenger Rail Authority, which is ably managed today by Patricia Quinn, its executive director. But without having that ability to manage it free to a certain extent from political involvements, that's why the train is running today during the endemic, is because it's independently managed. So ask yourselves, who's going to manage this service once you get it? Because it's not on track.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Wayne, because that's another, and this is a longer term thing, but we, Transportation for America has been doing great work on developing multi-state passenger rail legislation to promote the creation of multi-state passenger rail commissions, modeled after NEPRA, modeled after the Southern Rail Commission. We hope to include that in reauthorization. And I think creating those kinds of every multi-state group should have a LOR, should have a MIPRIC, because it really helps to coordinate. And not every, you just can't have a successful if you're just single state out there on your own. And so that kind of coordination authority is necessary. And we are looking to work with Congress to help develop a series of those across the US.
Yeah, and we will also, once all the FRA-led regional plans are put together, we'll also need to do some fine tuning of those, because like certain things, like the Heartland Flyer extension, it's in the plan, but it really doesn't take into account because it's not within the scope of the project, the economic opportunity from the South. Having that connection from the South up into the Midwest will be really great.
Such a good point. Yeah.
There's no capacity right now, which is frustrating, but they don't, in a sense, the FRA-led Midwest plan is going to be in some ways saying, these are possibilities, but it doesn't have the scope to, there's not a Mid-South plan right now. There's a Southwest one, and Southeast. But anyway, to connect that, to say what are the magnitudes? What could we be seeing? Like, do we need a hub in Kansas City, for example? Because of what might be possible from there, things like that.
This is awesome. Okay. This is a great panel. Obviously, Wayne, I'm so glad that you're here. I'm glad that Laura and Deborah are here. I have one question left. It's kind of a two-part question. This is for Jim and Sean. We've had a couple iterations of this in the chat. So to Jim, is your team advocating for the return of all long daily service in these steps forward? Is that going to include pushing for Cardinal, pushing for Sunset? If so, how are they doing that? The other part of it to Sean, what time frame are you recommending for the $1.5 billion for Amtrak to cover for the restoration of all of these long distance systems? Is this going to be the end of FY21 or just the end of the calendar year?
I'll answer first because mine's real short and easy. It's at end of FY21, which is September 30th, 2021. So, fiscal year 2022, that's a whole nother issue we're gonna have to deal with. Hopefully we'll be returning to normal. This will be the last of the pandemic year. But it's FY21 numbers.
And that does actually feed pretty nicely to my answer, because part of what we're pushing for in a rescue package is the return of daily service. That's not an appropriate vehicle for us to use to talk about a daily Cardinal or a daily Sunset. Now, that said, are we making the case for a daily Cardinal and a daily Sunset? We sure are. No question that we're doing that. It's probably going to require a separate piece of legislation to get that done. But we're also pushing with Amtrak as well. The economics of 3 times a week trains we know are bad, and we have spent a lot of time trying to build support within the Congress for restoration of daily service, even before we were worried about COVID. And as Sean noted at the beginning, Senator Manchin now has a lot of chips to spend, and a daily cardinal is fairly high on Senator Manchin's list. So sometimes the stars just have to align, and I think the stars may have aligned in this instance. But you're certainly not going to get a daily cardinal or daily sunset in a piece of rescue legislation.
Right.
But will you get it in an appropriation? Will you get it in an authorization? Yeah, that's a possibility. So a lot of these are sort of multi-step initiatives, and it can be awfully frustrating, I know, for advocates when we send messages saying talk about this and not about that.
Right.
But trust us on this one. We are working on all those issues, and we just need
That's
you to.
what I was going to reiterate with Jim, what he said about that you focus now on getting the Amtrak daily service that was in FY 2019. That's what you have to focus on now. Don't mention, and we also want to have, these routes be daily, just get it. We need to get the service restored that we had first.
Cool. Well, that's all really insightful. And thank you guys for joining us on the Q&A. Thanks for taking time to listen to our members' questions. That wraps it up for this segment. I'm going to kick it back to Joe.
All right, thank you. I just want to briefly thank everybody for joining today. Sean, Jim, as always, Laura, Deborah, and Wayne. You guys were a fantastic panel. There was a ton of information. Madi for running the Q&A, and as Madi said earlier, railpassers.org/webinars. You will find all this information loaded up on YouTube later on this week. The full video, the PDF of the presentation. We will actually, there's a couple files that are throwing around websites. We'll have everyone's links, everything going on. But I also want to invite you, all our guests and our viewers and our callers on the phone to join us next month. We'll be changing up a little bit. We're going to do something a little less single topic with a very, very special guest who needs no introduction, really. Mayor John Robert Smith from Meridian, now in DC, Transportation for America. He'll be joining Jim Mathews, kind of in a coffee break sort of fireside chat back and forth. We're going to have a bunch of Q&A. We're going to get all the questions from our members and our fellow advocates, as well as questions from the chat during the presentation. So join us February 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern for our next event. And once again, thank you from all of us at the Rail Passenger Association. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks to our panel, and thank you everyone for sticking with us as we went a little bit over. Thanks very much, everybody.